Last year, for the 35th anniversary of the Super Mario series, I made a video ranking every mainline Super Mario game, and then I made another video ranking every Super Mario spin-off series. Given the fact that it's Pokemon's 25th anniversary this year, I want to do the same thing for this franchise. And this is your first warning. It very well may make you angry, but the good news is I do encourage you to make your own rankings in the comments down below. Cool? Cool. Let's talk about it. If its length and the fact that this is uploaded the day after I usually upload videos didn't give it away, I put a lot of time and effort into making this video. So if you enjoy it, I would appreciate it a lot if you click the like button and shared it with a friend, even more than usual. I know a lot of you guys have said you like longer videos, but they usually don't perform as well. This is me trying to change that a bit. Okay, on to the video. Last time I made a set of videos like this, I summarized how I felt about each Mario game in the current day in terms of how well each one held up and gave them each a score from 1 to 35 to coincide with the 35th anniversary of the Mario brand's existence. That score didn't end up being as calculated as I feel like it could have been, so this time I'm going to make it based off of 5 separate categories that will all net a maximum of 5 points each, so still 25 for the 25th anniversary. Theming, just, you know, more calculated theming. The 5 categories in question will be 1. Gameplay, which will be primarily based on the mechanics introduced in terms of how impactful they continue to be for the Pokemon series overall, but more importantly, how well they work in the game they were initially introduced in. 2. Story, which I feel is pretty self-explanatory. It's the story, also the lore, but you know, story. 3. Replayability, also self-explanatory, but a telltale sign for this will be how good the past game is for a given generation. Also, how necessary it is to experience that region in a given generation. For instance, do I want to play through Johto in a Gen 2 game? Spoilers. No. Number 4, region. This is basically in terms of how memorable the setting of the main game in a generation is, as well as the Pokemon designs introduced in that given region. And finally, 5, extras, which will primarily account for things like remakes and the director's cut games for a given generation, as well as the individual post games that are brought about in every new game, including those remakes and director's cuts. Pokemon games then will be somewhat tricky to judge because despite what many may claim, Pokemon games have been on a consistent upward trend for the most part. Every game makes noteworthy, impactful improvements somewhere. In case you're not a listener to our podcast and aren't aware that I'm pretty nostalgia averse when it comes to judging media, I tend to gravitate towards judging games based on how they hold up in the now, rather than giving them extra brownie points for how they made me feel when they were new. It's important to note that for this video, I'm going to be rewarding games that introduce impactful mechanics or design choices, even if games after them continue to iterate on that given new mechanic, unless a future iteration completely reinvigorated that particular feature. For instance, I will be praising Gen 4 for introducing the competitive battling scene, even though every game since has made important strides towards improving it. Most of them won't get a nod since what they did was inconsequential in comparison. Got it? Okay, Gen 1 time. I know what you're thinking. The first generation of Pokemon, clearly god tier with a near perfect score. It set the standard for every game we have now. It's the only generation of Pokemon that has its own segment of the fandom named after it in the form of Gen 1ers. And Game Freak shows the Kanto region and its Pokemon the most love because all of this, so clearly it'll get one of, if not the highest scores. And you'd be right if this was someone else's video that holds any of that in high enough regard to propel this set of Gen 1 games toward the upper echelon of Pokemon games. I, on the other hand, think that the hiccups associated with the former resulted in games that had a lot of bugs, even for the time, and aged worse out of every other Pokemon game, bar none. In terms of gameplay, I'm giving this generation a 2, straight up. And yes, I get it established a foundation for what we have today and blah blah blah, but a lot of those systems in this generation just straight up didn't work to the point where an entire type, namely Ghost, was actually useless since its psychic effectiveness was botched in the code. The amount of Gen 1 problems is a video all on its own that I'm sure you could find on this platform, but just know the gameplay is the biggest knock for Gen 1. Of course, that's not to say everything else is perfect, because I'd give the story a 3, which isn't bad to be clear, especially for this series. It's just standard. Nothing to write home about one way or the other. Replayability is also in the standard category, but I'd actually give it a 2, as there's not much of it beyond revisiting the games for nostalgic purposes. Its systems being bugged also hurt it on the multiplayer end, which inherently lessens the longevity of the games. The region, on the other hand, is where we get into the high points for Gen 1. The Pokemon designs have clearly stood the test of time. They're at the forefront of everyone's minds, and there's a reason Game Freak reuses them so much, and it's because the region as a whole has incredible staying power. That is the thing about Gen 1 that has Gen 1ers in a chokehold. The actual games are bad, but the design of the world, the memorable characters that were introduced, and the sheer amount of iconic Pokemon are all cream of the crop and have arguably been untouched since the day Pokemon was introduced. So yeah, the region is getting a 5 out of 5. As far as extras are concerned, there weren't many beyond Pokemon Yellow, which as a fan of the anime was a cool addition to the game series. Having Pikachu as a partner Pokemon is cool. Getting to experience anime-inspired story beats in Gift Pokemon is cool, and the Pikachu minigames were cool. But the fact that this game didn't really do much to enhance the content beyond being referential to the anime in those neat but ultimately minor ways, I think results in a lower than average score for the extras category. I'm going to give Gen 1 a 2 here for a grand total of 14 points out of 25. Not terrible, but there's plenty of room for improvement, which I think is a good thing. Also, if it makes you feel better, feel free to multiply all of these scores by 4 in your head, because it averages out to 100, which usually is the type of point scale that's used on the internet. The second generation of Pokemon is an interesting place because by all accounts, it's the perfect sequel. It fixed many of the impactful bugs in the first generation. It basically doubled the amount of content available in the original game by adding the Kanto region to the Johto games to complement the newly introduced Johto region. Breeding was introduced, shinies were brought into the game, albeit not really in a way that makes them important to the gameplay, since they couldn't be as directly affected by the player since the Masuda method didn't exist yet. The special stat split that changed the special stat to special attack and special defense, and Gen 2 was the first generation to acknowledge that girls would want to play Pokemon too. Truly a wild time. And for that, I'd had to give this generation a score of 3 for the gameplay, mostly because of the increased length and breadth of content, but it's also held down by its level scaling and overall pacing. It's still, like Gen 1, is a game that shows its age quite vividly, although not as much as Gen 1. For story, I'd also give it a slightly higher score of 3, since this game at least made an effort to add depth to your character's rival by giving him internal conflict and a character arc and all of that good stuff. But I can't give it much more than that, because outside of that, the story was pretty frail, all things considered. The strongest part of the story was the dynamic between the rival improving to the point of perhaps being the best rival in any Pokemon game ever. This game had a rival that was someone that didn't only exist to attempt to be better than the main character, and he had a character arc that didn't end in him just resigning to being worse than you and to only serve as your cheerleader because of that inferiority. Apart from that, the story has direct-to-DVD Disney sequel vibes, with the arbitrary return of Team Rocket that was brought about by characters we never saw before. To be fair, that's not bad for Pokemon stories, but since I think that makes the premise less clean, I'm giving the Gen 2 story a 3. That's nothing new or even particularly bad in terms of the Pokemon franchise, but it's also nothing special, except for one aspect that I'm tempted to change the ranking to a 0.5 system. Almost. Replayability for this gen is whatever, honestly. It takes a huge hit considering the fact that it's another generation that, when removed from nostalgia, is super hard to want to go back to. It's not unplayable by any means, but it's not getting any brownie points from me. I'm going to give Gen 2 a 3 for replayability as well. The region, flat out, I'm giving a 2, and I'm not even sorry about it. Some of the legendary and mythical Pokemon stuff is interesting, and Red Gyarados is cool, but all things considered, the most noteworthy thing about Gen 2 in this department is that it allows us access to Kanto. Off the top of my head, I can't name half of the gym leaders and towns in this region. Even both halves of the game's Elite Four are are carried by Gen 1. I'm not a huge fan of Game Freak making a region just Japan again, when the Pokemon world is a lot more interesting the more diverse it becomes, with new regions now opting to take inspiration from all over the world. Hot take or not, Johto is mostly forgettable, and I'm giving the region a score to reflect that. Extras for Gen 2, on the other hand, are above average given the fact that it literally, again, fit the entire Kanto region into what I would say is the first real post-game in a Pokemon generation. It let fans of the first generation of Pokemon not only experience the Kanto region again, but let them experience it 2 years removed from those original games, with character progression for many, if not all, of the noteworthy characters in the game. You even get to battle yourself. It's pretty sick and well worth playing through the game for exclusively that. But the dated mechanics of this game, combined with the fact that the better way to experience Johto is through Gen 4, I'm gonna have to dock it a little bit and give Gen 2 a 4 in the extras category. That brings Gen 2 to a 17 out of a possible 25. Gen 3 is when I think Game Freak showed glimpses of not just wanting Pokemon to be the best version of what it was before, but a truly reimagined experience in a lot of key ways. This resulted in a generation that not only on a base level is a style that aged a lot better than the first two, in a similar way to how SNES games aesthetically age better than NES games, it also was a game that had a lot of depth added to its gameplay, from something as simple as the ability to run to the more complex battle-specific improvements like its weather system, double battles, a feature that is still the primary competitive format to this day, as well as Pokemon natures and abilities. All of that combined, in my opinion, by far makes this generation the best example of Pokemon gameplay up until this point, and not just all of those new features. On top of that, it fixed the dated problems that existed in those first two generations. Gen 3 really endeavored to add so much to the battle system that it ended up being the biggest jump forward for battling, even to this day, with a couple exceptions that are spoilers coming up in Gen 4. All of that culminates in a gameplay experience that is worthy of a 5 out of 5. The story for Gen 3 is also a lot stronger than the first two generations, in my opinion. The world feels more fleshed out to an extent where the different versions of the primary game even have a slightly different twist on the state of the world throughout the story. The idea of your rival is flipped on its head once again, with your main rival, for better or worse, paving the way for the way rivals are handled now, with them being more of a friend rather than a love-hate relationship enemy sort of deal. And for the first time, they introduce a de facto secondary rival in Wally, who is very similar to Gen 2's rival in terms of character development. Your character even has a dad that plays a direct role in their lives, which is a Gen 3 exclusive. In summary, the story is amongst the strongest in the Pokemon mythos, so I'd say it warrants a 4 out of 5 in this category. Replayability for this generation is pretty high in my opinion. Fire Red and Leaf Green are the best ways to experience Gen 1 in a lot of ways, although I would say that Let's Go has an argument to be had in the conversation, and some would say the same about Emerald being the best for experiencing Hoenn. Like I said, these games don't really suffer from any of the inherent aging issues that the first two do if you play any number of 16-bit style games from today. All around good experience if you have the means to play it. I'd give it a 4 for replayability as well. I touched on it in the story section, but this region is a lot more fleshed out than the first two, and this also extends to the story side of the region. However, I don't think that the Pokemon in this generation are as strong as the first two, especially when you take into account the lack of biodiversity and resulting lack of new Pokemon and a lot of types like fire. The too much water meme, love it or hate it, has a lot of merit to it. With that said, Gen 3 gets a 3 in terms of its region. High highs and low lows. Extra content is respectable in the third generation, but it's entirely carried by Emerald and the remakes, as they both brought with them very solid post-game content in the form of the Battle Frontier and Sevi Islands respectively. The former was a good way to push players to put more thought into their competitive Pokemon battling strategies, and the Sevi Islands is almost as close as we've ever gotten to Game Freak throwing a second region into a Pokemon game. And that deserves praise in my opinion. I'd have to give Gen 3 a 5 in the extras category, and that brings its total score to 19 out of a possible 25. Gen 4 continued where Gen 3 left off in terms of pushing the series forward in impactful ways that will remain in today's Pokemon games. It was the first generation to really kick off the competitive battling scene in ways that I honestly think stand side by side in importance rather than one standing above the other. The physical and special split for attack and defense being one of them. Prior to these games, special attacks were based entirely on the type of attack rather than an attack by attack basis like is the case now. And this added another layer of gameplay because with that came the ability to say have a physical electric type attacker like Luxray. In addition to that, the scene was able to develop thanks to the introduction of Nintendo Wi-Fi connection on Nintendo DS. All of that results in a quality gameplay experience. I'm going to give it a 5 out of 5 in the gameplay category. I'm pretty mixed on the story for Gen 4. I appreciate it for being the first game to directly address the lore of the Pokemon world in a way that goes beyond environmental storytelling via the Canalave Library segment of the game, but I think there's a lot of pacing issues with the game that detract from the experience for me, enough to not be able to really reward the story for breaking that ground. Also, it still just amounted to an exposition dump, and that's never great to do in games. I'll give Gen 4 a 3 in story. Not great, but not terrible either. For replayability, at least at the time of recording this video, this is literally the only way to experience Sinnoh and catch a large portion of the Pokemon from that gen that doesn't include playing Pokemon Go, and it might as well be the only way to experience the Johto region, since not only are the remakes of that the best version of the region, they're in contention for the best Pokemon games period if you ask me. Both are enjoyable in their own right, so I'll give Gen 4 a 5 out of 5 in replayability. In terms of the region, this is another one that is pretty fleshed out by Pokemon standards. It's the first to sort of veer away from direct Japan inspiration geographically, with it being partially inspired by Russia, and the characters as well as the Pokemon are also pretty strong and memorable. I'm personally not a huge fan of the kaiju aesthetic a lot of the Pokemon are sporting, and the evolutions for Pokemon from past gens are amongst my least favorite, excluding the new evolutions, but I know plenty of people are fans of these things, so I'm not going to fault it too much for that. I'd give Gen 4's region a 4 out of 5. Gen 4 is yet another strong contender in the extras department. Honestly, it's a repeat of Gen 3 in terms of the quantity of quality post-game content, both in the third game, Pokemon Platinum, but also the remakes HeartGold and SoulSilver being Johto and Kanto and all of that. It also gets bonus points for the Wi-Fi introduction, and I didn't even mention the GTS, which in fairness, in retrospect, is kind of bad, but either way, Gen 4 gets a 5 in the extras category, bringing its total to 22 out of a possible 25. Gen 5 is where I'm going to try to speed things up a bit. This video is getting way too long, and these games are obviously a lot more recent, so there's less that it's groundbreaking, and at the same time, less negatives to go over on average. Gameplay, I'm giving a 3. Gen 5 didn't bring anything super worthwhile to the table, and on the whole is pretty forgettable in the grand scheme of things. Also, the game played pretty sluggish during battles. Story gets a 5. It's widely considered to be one of the best stories in Pokemon by many, and the fact that it's the only duo of Pokemon games, other than remakes, that have gotten anything close to a direct sequel is pretty cool. In my opinion, the story's themes are mid at best if we're talking narrative across all mediums, and in the end, it doesn't actually address the moral conundrum it presents, but for a Pokemon game, it's more than solid enough. Region gets a 3. N is memorable, Iris is memorable, some of the set pieces on a visual level are memorable, but on the whole, the region is largely forgettable in my opinion. The American inspiration is also whatever, considering the fact that they did the stereotypical outside perspective thing and condensed the entirety of the country to being New York, but with a desert, which is dumb. Region is getting a 3. Extras also gets a 3. Again, the sequels are cool and the post game is decent if you're into training Pokemon for competitive battling, but on the whole, there aren't a whole lot of reasons to continue playing after credits roll. And this is yet another generation without a remake to help it gain ground here. Despite that, it still has a pretty good score with a grand total of 19 out of a possible 25. Gen 6 is the first generation to bring the series into full 3D, and with that came a game that actually ran pretty poorly on the 3DS. That is the only thing that keeps me from giving the generation a 5 in terms of gameplay. Mega Evolution was such a welcome twist to the formula that also brought with it a fun way to iterate on existing evolutionary lines without opening Pandora's box by actually giving them additional evolutions. I'm giving it a 4 for Megas alone, to be honest. The story is whatever. The Lysander twist was stupid. I'm giving it a 3. Moving on. The region, again, in my opinion, is whatever, but again, I do have to show them praise for continuing to try new things with the inspiration for the region. France was a cool setting. The Pokemon from this gen and the characters were nothing to write home about in either direction though, so I'd have to give region a 3. Extras gets a 4. The Delta episode was a phenomenal post-game addition for the remake. Contest coming back in Oras was cool, but X and Y didn't have anything super special in this category. It could have been a 5 if a revitalized Battle Frontier of some sort came with it instead of just a memorial service, but it didn't, so I'll have to give it a 4 in the extras category, bringing the total for this generation to 17 out of a possible 25. Perhaps one of the most divisive generations to date, Gen 7 is mostly a victim of not introducing anything big in terms of staying power. I personally appreciate it for trying to go above and beyond with trying new things with this series in terms of its story, its setting, etc, but fans don't seem to agree even remotely. In fairness, there are a lot of places where Gen 7 falls short. There wasn't anything that these games brought to the table with gameplay in the grand scheme of things outside of the fact that the gym challenge is technically not there, but the trials are still sort of like gyms, just more geared towards minigame like scenarios. I'd give gameplay a 3. The story was standard Pokemon in terms of quality, but the most interesting part about it isn't so much a plus to this category, so I'll have to give Gen 7 a 3 in story as well. Gen 7 has next to no replayability as someone that attempted to play through Ultra Sun and wanted to quit when I was just a bit over halfway through. Those games were the whole reason why I have no doubt in my mind that DLC should be the move for these director's cut games, but we'll get to that. Replayability gets a 2. The region is this game's strongest aspect. Polynesia is a fantastic region of the world to pull from, and the cultural cues this game takes from it made the world building in this game pretty strong. The Pokemon designs are pretty solid, and it also being the first game to introduce regional variants for classic Pokemon is very noteworthy. I'm giving Gen 7 a 5 in terms of region. Extras is a bit tricky because I'm not sure if I consider Let's Go a Gen 7 game or a Gen 8 game, but assuming it's not the former and we're just basing this off of Sun and Ultra Sun and Moon and Ultra Moon, these games are decent in the post game for shiny hunting. Team Rainbow Rocket is pretty cool. Nothing else really comes to mind. I'll have to give Gen 7 a 3 in the extras category, bringing its total to 16 out of a possible 25. Finally, Gen 8 is the trickiest one because, well, obviously it's still not done. We know 2 games at the very least are on their way that could propel this generation forward, and I do want to put them into consideration, but I'll do so where it makes sense, seeing as though obviously we can't play them yet. So starting with what we can play, Sword and Shield in tandem with the DLC amount to my favorite Pokemon games of all time. It added a lot of quality of life improvements. I actually prefer the cut to fat approach to story rather than the dedicated focus to a mediocre B plot, and the existence of the DLC in and of itself is a phenomenally big W for Pokemon fans and something that should reinvent how the series is released moving forward. Not only is it more economical for the player that tried to play everything, it's also respectful of our time. I feel like Ultra Sun and Moon's additional content would have massively benefited from this approach, for example. Of course, it's by no means perfect. There are performance issues and there isn't a lot of new things added to the gameplay. So with that said, I'm giving gameplay a 3. The story isn't really much of one, as I alluded to with the cut the fat comment, and while I appreciate that, I do think it's not worthy of a good score, so I'll give the story a 1 out of 5. Replayability is nothing special, so it gets a standard score of 3 out of 5. The region, on the other hand, is another example of a well-established region with a solid inspiration, a ton of noteworthy characters thanks to the increased focus on battling in this region, and I think the new Pokemon in this game are solid. Not that it really fits here, but Exit is an actual non-issue given the fact that even without a lot of Pokemon returning, the game still boasts one of the largest pools of Pokemon attainable in a game with the DLC. I'm giving region a 5 out of 5, and I'm not sorry about it. Finally, extras. Again, the DLC gives this game a lot in this category, but assuming the upcoming games are even half as good as they look, the sheer amount of content being made available with the upcoming Sinnoh games easily earns this generation a 5 in extras. Feel free to let me know in the comments if they end up bad and this ages poorly. I know you want to. For now though, Gen 8 gets a total score of 18 out of 25. Here's the final ranking of each generation on screen. And that is how I would rank and score every generation of mainline Pokemon game. What do you think? How would you rank them? Let me know that and more in the comments down below. Thanks for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, I would appreciate it if you clicked the like button and subscribed if you haven't already for new videos like this, ideally every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern time. Okay, that's it for me. See you next week.